Welcome to This Explainer. Let's dive right into tracing the fascinating and honestly terrifying life cycle of the greatest superpower rivalry of the 20th century. We're going to look at the Cold War today, and not just as a dusty series of historical dates to memorize, but as a deeply complex system of ideological clashes, technological races, and high-stakes global chess moves that defined modern history for nearly half a century. So how did two allies go from defeating fascism to threatening the end of the world? This crucial paradox frames our entire journey today. As we explore the source material, we'll see exactly how the united front of World War II fractured into a near-apocalyptic standoff. Think about it for a second. How do you go from shipping vast quantities of Lend-Lease materials, trucks, tanks, food, to a wartime ally, to suddenly building tens of thousands of nuclear weapons aimed directly at their major cities? Section 1. The Fractured Alliance and Post-World War II Tensions. We begin in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where the literal ashes of a defeated Germany became the breeding ground for new mutual suspicions. You see, the US and the Soviet Union had completely opposing ideas about post-war security. On the left, we've got the US vision. They understood security in situational terms, which was heavily influenced by the 1941 Atlantic Charter. They basically envisioned peace through a rebuilt capitalist global market, free trade, and US economic leadership. The belief was that a prosperous, economically interconnected world just wouldn't go to war with itself, right? It would prevent another global depression and create strong trading partners. Now contrast that with the right side. Soviet leaders understood security in terms of physical space. Their historical experience involved repeated invasions over 150 years, from Napoleon to Hitler, which culminated in a catastrophic 20 million dead and tens of thousands of cities completely leveled in World War II. To them, true security literally meant physical buffer zones and Red Army control over Eastern Europe to guarantee they would never, ever be caught off guard by a Western invasion again. While these competing visions didn't just stay on paper, they rapidly hardened into action. The U.S. introduced the Marshall Plan in 1947, injecting over $13 billion to rebuild capitalist economies in Western Europe. The goal here was to revitalize these nations, making communism a lot less appealing to their populations while securing future trading partners for American industries. The Soviet Union rejected this outright. They interpreted it as American economic imperialism designed to just buy European loyalty. So they responded by establishing Comecon to lock in strict economic cooperation among communist states. But the real turning point is that third bullet. The first major confrontation arrived with the 1948 Berlin blockade. The Soviets tried to force the Western Allies out by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to Berlin. This prompted the massive U.S. Berlin airlift, flying thousands of supply missions just to keep the city alive. By 1949, diplomatic tensions had shifted to the very brink of direct military conflict. The lines were permanently drawn. Moving on to Section 2, Racing for the Stars, the Space Race. As terrestrial borders in Europe locked into place behind what famously became known as the Iron Curtain, the superpowers turned their eyes upward, expanding their rivalry into a completely new arena, outer space. You have to remember, the space race wasn't just some science project. It evolved directly from military missile development. After World War II, both sides started building long-range intercontinental ballistic weapons to carry nuclear payloads. This rocketry development quickly turned into a back-and-forth sprint for atmospheric dominance. The Soviets actually took the early leads. They stunned the world by launching Sputnik, the first satellite, and then putting Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into orbit. The U.S. responded aggressively with the Mercury and Gemini programs to catch up, eventually pushing the very boundaries of engineering to culminate in the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. But surprisingly, after the lunar missions and all that intense rivalry, the temperature eventually cooled. It transitioned into an era of joint space cooperation, culminating in missions like Apollo-Soyuz. Both nations actually started envisioning a permanent, shared human presence in orbit. But beneath this technological sprint lay a profound and, frankly, troubling historical reality regarding how these programs started. Through Project Paperclip, both the US and the Soviets rushed to absorb former enemy intelligence to secure an immediate edge. Project Paperclip essentially brought hundreds of German and Austrian engineers and scientists into the American program to accelerate rocket technology. Many of these individuals had wartime records that were subsequently obscured. It really forces us to examine the immense moral compromises made by both superpowers in the name of national security and the relentless pursuit of technological supremacy. Section 3, 13 Days of Terror, better known as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Those incredible leaps in rocketry that allowed humans to orbit the Earth eventually brought us crashing back down to the ground for the climax of our story.
This timeline maps out a terrifyingly rapid escalation. In July 1962, Soviet Premier Khrushchev and Fidel Castro secretly agreed to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. But on October 14th, a U.S. U-2 spy plane photographed the launch sites being built. By October 22nd, President Kennedy ordered a strict naval quarantine of the island and went on national television to tell the public. Look at October 26th and 27th. The crisis reached a virtual stalemate. U.S. strategic forces were placed at DEFCON 2. That is the highest alert level short of an actual attack, meaning thermonuclear war was considered imminent. Adding to the panic, a U.S. U-2 jet was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. The entire world was literally on a knife's edge, nervously listening to the radio, just waiting for the first catastrophic strike. Then, in the darkest hour, an unexpected breakthrough arrived. Let us take measures to untie that knot. This wasn't some stiff, formal bureaucratic speak. It was a desperate plea from one leader to another to find an off-ramp from total annihilation. This highly emotional midnight letter from Khrushchev humanized the standoff. He recognized that events were completely spiraling out of their control and proposed removing the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba.
Now, the crucial point here is how this standoff actually ended. The public watched the Soviets back down and agreed to dismantle their Cuban sites, which looked like a clear, definitive victory for the United States. But behind the scenes, a secret, face-saving diplomatic compromise is what actually saved the world. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador and agreed to quietly remove U.S. Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. Those Jupiter missiles were a massive threat to the Soviets because of their close proximity. They were capable of striking Moscow with almost zero warning. By quietly removing them months later, both sides got what they needed to claim security. It was an absolute masterclass in secret diplomacy, pulling the world back from the brink.
Section 4. The Unraveling Empire and the Soviet Decline. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1980s. The immediate threat of nuclear war had ebbed and flowed, but a totally new kind of crisis was emerging. The massive economic burdens of trying to keep up with the American military buildup, combined with a highly unpopular, costly, and unwinnable war in Afghanistan, began to rot the Soviet system from the inside out. We can't go on living like this. This private confession by the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to his wife on the night of his appointment perfectly captures the sheer level of disgust and exhaustion present within the faltering superpower. The Soviet economy was a ramshackle affair. They were suffering from chronic shortages of basic consumer goods, all while an enormous percentage of its GDP was siphoned off for military spending. Gorbachev realized that radical structural changes were completely necessary if they were going to survive. So to fix the ailing empire, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, basically a policy of openness. He sincerely hoped that giving people a voice, ending state censorship, and allowing a free flow of ideas would help citizens calmly and rationally pinpoint inefficiencies to fix the system. But it unintentionally unleashed a massive floodgate of public dissent. He fundamentally underestimated the deep, decades-long resentment brewing in Soviet satellite states. By choosing a radically different path and refusing to use military force to crush uprisings, like standing back when Poland elected the non-communist Solidarity Union or when ordinary citizens famously took hammers to physically dismantle the Berlin Wall in 1989, Gorbachev allowed satellite states to boldly vote out their communist regimes. Once the fear of Soviet tanks was removed, the floodgates simply couldn't be closed again. Section 5. A World Transformed. The Post-Cold War Era. The relatively bloodless collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 completely shocked the world. But that immediate democratic euphoria of the early 90s soon gave way to harsh new global realities. As we can see here, transitioning from a heavily state-controlled system to a capitalist market was incredibly chaotic for Russia. The economic misery didn't just vanish when they lowered the Soviet flag. Instead, Russia faced a deeply stagnant economy, rampant privatization, corruption, and a devastating ruble devaluation that resulted in hyperinflation, literally wiping out the life savings of everyday citizens overnight. However, they did eventually bounce back. By the early 2000s, under new leadership, Russia's economy was growing steadily. Poverty was significantly reduced, and the government began heavily leveraging its vast natural gas and oil resources to forcefully rebound on the global stage. They started supplying massive amounts of energy to Europe and wielding that economic leverage as a powerful political tool. This complex aftermath leaves historians fundamentally split today. On one hand, you have the perspective of economist Paul Krugman, who argues that the Soviet collapse was the definitive death of the socialist dream.
He sees it as proving the absolute permanent victory of capitalist democracy, even if that initial transition was immensely rough. On the other hand, you have historian Robert Kagan, who argues that the end of the Cold War was just an illusion of permanent peace. He suggests we are merely seeing the return of great power nationalism, autocracy, and a traditional Russian appetite for centralized power and regional dominance, pointing to recent conflicts in places like Moldova and Georgia. We present both of these perspectives here because understanding this fundamental split in interpretation is absolutely essential to understanding the roots of modern global politics.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. When we look at the shifting global alliances, the aggressive use of economic leverage, and the nationalist rhetoric used on the world stage today, we really have to ask ourselves, did the Cold War truly end when the Soviet flag was lowered in 1991, or did the great power rivalry just change its shape for the 21st century? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.